This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday. I believe it is the 29th of October, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks. Good to be with you again on the podcast. Michael has not come on yet, but we are just going to go ahead and proceed and start presenting the podcast. So for those of you who are waiting, we are ready to go. So let me just start off by doing some general commentary about some stuff that has been going on. For those of you who are familiar with the Observations podcast, and prior to that, the weblog that we used to do, the Questions and Observations weblog, we didn't like a lot of things about the modern Libertarian Party. And so we came up with this idea called neo-libertarian. We're broadly libertarian in viewpoint, but we kind of reject sort of the anarcho-capitalist capture of the Libertarian Party and an increasing strain of, I guess the Libertarian Party would call it pacifism, but I think it's really non-interventionism. And one of the things that really just sort of fascinated me this week was something that the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire posted, and the Libertarian National Party went ahead and reposted. And by the way, we're seeing two things down there on the bottom of the screen. That's because I have Michael's Zoom window still on. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off until such time as Michael joins us. And this is the post. Pearl Harbor was provoked. 9/11 was provoked. Russia's invasion was provoked. October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel was provoked. And this is very disappointing to see. And by the way, people who are in the Libertarian Party say, why doesn't anybody ever want to join the Libertarian Party? Why is it always, 1% of the electorate? Well, things like this are why. And I just want to go back and touch on some of the historical inaccuracies that we're seeing here from this post. First of all, Pearl Harbor was provoked. Yes, it was. It was provoked by Japan. If you want to get into the tit for tat about how Pearl Harbor came about, we have to go all the way back to 1932, when Japan invaded China. There was no warning. There was no reason for Japan to invade China. There was no dispute at issue going on with the Chinese. Certainly the Chinese were not trying to threaten Japan, but Japan had been moving into Asia for quite a while, and the assault on China in, I believe it was 1932, when Japan first began to invade in Manchuria, was completely unprovoked. Now, from 1932 to 1941, December 7th of 1941, the United States diplomatically supported China because China had been attacked by Japan. And as time went on and Japan moved further into China, eventually setting up a really a puppet state in Manchuria that the Japanese named Manchukuo, the United States had a harder and harder diplomatic line because the United States had long had interests in China, and China had long been sort of a keystone to the United States Asian policy, and China and the United States were, if not allied, we had a fairly close relationship. Ultimately, in the late 1930s and 1940s, the United States just decided to stop sending certain supplies to Japan. Japan through the 1930s and 1940s, was not self-sufficient in oil. It was not self-sufficient in many raw materials. And indeed, the entire reason for its invasion of China and ultimately all of Southeast Asia was to acquire the raw materials that they needed to keep their industrial economy going. And as part of that, the United States ultimately stopped sending metal to Japan and ultimately embargoed all oil shipments, all petroleum shipments to Japan. This put Japan in a very bad state because they desperately relied on U.S. imports and general Western imports of these supplies to keep their economy going. And it was as a result of this that they attacked Pearl Harbor. So this thing about Pearl Harbor was provoked. Sure, if you want to go back to 1938 and 1939 and consider the American response to Japan's entirely unjustified invasion of China, if you want to consider that the provocation, I suppose you can, but the history started before that. 9/11 was provoked. Not even sure what that's about. Other than the United States supports Israel. Russia's invasion was provoked. Well, let's talk about that. It is true that U.S. officials had, in the early 1990s, told the then president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, that NATO had no plans to expand eastward. That turned out to be untrue. And NATO did expand eastward, and of course East Germany reunified with West Germany, which was of course a NATO state. Poland joined. Ultimately, the Czech Republic and Slovakia joined. The Balkan states also eventually joined NATO, and so NATO kind of moved towards the east. Now, the Russians didn't like this, but the fact is the Warsaw Pact was dead. Russia no longer controlled the politics or policies of all of the Eastern European nations as they did from 1945 to 1991. And guess what? States who are free of a foreign overseer can make whatever diplomatic or defense arrangements they like. And it's none of Russia's business. Yes, I understand the Russians are xenophobic and paranoid, but Russia's invasion was provoked. October 7th was provoked. How was that provoked? By Israel withdrawing entirely from the Gaza Strip in 2005. You know, there was a ceasefire in place on October 7th, a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel. It wasn't Israel that broke it. And so there are historical problems with a tweet like this. Even more so, there are policy problems. And this is where it gets us into a weird area. And it's an area, by the way, that I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the policy prescription is. Here's what I do know. In 1945, pretty much everyone in the West, everyone not in the Soviet sphere of influence, came to a general agreement, which was that the Soviet Union was dangerous, that it had reneged on all of its promises during World War II to allow free and democratic elections in the occupied countries, the Nazi-occupied countries that they liberated, and they went back on it. Indeed, what they did in all of the countries that they quote-unquote liberated is ensured that those countries would have a communist government that were basically a puppet regime of the Soviet Union. Also, in the absence of a weakened British Empire, the United States, going head-to-head with Russia ultimately as the only superpower during the late 40s and early 50s, we generally came to an agreement both in Southeast and Southwest Asia, and also in the Atlantic, that the United States would be the security guarantor of open trade between essentially the Western nations or those nations that were allied with us in Asia. And that was the deal. The United States would have a big navy. We would patrol the sea lanes. We would be the ones who put down piracy and other hazards of international trade. And we would have a more or less free and open system of international trade that was backed by a U.S. security guarantee. One of the lessons that we purportedly learned through the 1930s was that isolationism is not a policy that is sustainable over the long run. Not in a modern world where aircraft can just fly over from another continent and begin dropping bombs. It was great from 1776 right up until 1941 to live in a world where we thought that the United States, being protected by two very large oceans, would make any sort of invasion of the United States unlikely in the extreme. And we could afford to be an isolationist nation. We could keep hands off of European affairs, and quite frankly, keeping hands off of European affairs was a great idea. In a world where you have globe-spanning navies and ultimately globe-spanning aircraft and then intercontinental ballistic missiles, it's difficult to see how you embark on a policy of isolation, especially in an environment where you have another superpower who will, through proxy wars or thinly disguised invasions, will continue to overthrow other countries and expand their empires. Isolationism was just off the table during the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, we figured there'd be a big peace dividend. And we figured we didn't have to worry about a multipolar war. And it didn't happen quickly. It didn't certainly happen overnight. But if you look back from 1991 to 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, and Donald Trump was really, in many ways, a personification of this idea, we have our fingers in too many pies all across the world. And by the way, I wouldn't argue that is false. I mean, we certainly spent 20 years in Afghanistan wasting blood and treasure for nothing. Largely the same thing happened in Iraq. Indeed, one could argue that ultimately the result of our invasion, occupation, and withdrawal from Iraq ended up being an invitation for more activity from Iran to spread Islamic fundamentalism. So we're not good at foreign interventions. We're certainly not good at occupation and nation building. The reason why we could nation build in Germany after World War II, and to the same extent Japan, although for slightly different reasons, was primarily because we had bombed them into rubble. Every major metropolitan area in Germany and ultimately Japan had just been flattened by American bombing campaigns. They clearly lost. They basically were forced into an unconditional surrender and an occupation of their country. Germany, of course, had always been, even though they never liked to think of themselves as a Western country. Indeed, if you look back in the 1930s, many of Hitler's speeches are about how Germany is different from what he called the West. Germany was what the Germans referred to as Mitteleuropa, Middle Europe. It wasn't part of the West. It wasn't part of the East. It was a special thing. However, the basic political ideas that animated Germany were basically Western Enlightenment ideas. As much as Germany wanted to think of itself as not being part of the West, intellectually and culturally, it was. And so what happened after World War II during the occupation and the denazification kind of reverted Germany back towards the mean of being a Western country. Now, Japan is a slightly different case because Japan, an Asian country, definitely not a Western country, but one that in the 19th century, after Japan decided to come out of its, after the United States essentially forced Japan out of its self-imposed isolation, which, by the way, I think I'm going to want to come back to. Japan immediately realized that the Western nations were the most powerful, and to the extent that they could, they emulated Western ideas, Western science, Western technology, engineering into Japanese society, a society that had rejected all of these ideas for the previous 300 years. Japan, since the Tokugawa shogunate, had been an isolationist country. You know what broke Japan out of their isolationism? American battleships steaming into Tokyo Bay under the command of Commodore Perry in 1885 or something. And the shoguns realized, hey, we cannot remain split apart from world affairs. That kind of forced Japan into a restoration of the emperor and into a 100-year struggle or 75-year struggle to modernize their entire country to make it the equal of the West using Western methods. And so whenever they lost World War II and their country was occupied and the emperor told them to surrender, they did. And as the emperor cooperated with General MacArthur, who was leading the American occupation of Japan, the Japanese people built a society that was more along Western lines. Indeed, prior to the Japanese militarists in the 1920s sort of taking over Japan's government, Japan was tending towards a more modern Western-style electoral system. So I think we can argue that even though it wasn't traditionally Japanese, and that Japan was traditionally an isolationist country with a very unique culture, Japan, after being forced out of isolationism by Commodore Perry, jumped full scale into being a modern, industrial, internationalist country. Japan felt, wisely, even in 1885, that the ability of Japan to remain isolationist was coming to an end. By the way, prior to December 7, 1941, the America First movement was probably the largest single political constituency in this country, another isolationist movement. To the extent that America was not isolationist, our aims were aimed at the Western Hemisphere, trying to keep the Europeans out of the West. Outside of that, we had very much a hands-off policy for the rest of the world. Does isolationism work today? This thing that the Libertarian Party is talking about and that apparently it wants, this isolationist idea, is that doable in today's modern world? In a world where, look, right now, the technology to create nuclear weapons is, 1945 to 2023, it's 80 years old. Pretty much any state that has access to radioactive materials can at this point build a nuclear weapon. Intercontinental ballistic missile technology is 60 years old. That is not technology you can keep under wraps. You have a country like North Korea that is desperately poor, that has literally no natural resources to speak of, who probably have nuclear weapons and who certainly have intermediate range ballistic missiles. The North Koreans could, if they wanted, today, most likely, light off a massive EMP attack over the west coast of the United States that would destroy the electrical grid for everyone who lives west of Colorado, more or less. And it would probably kill millions of people because of the disruption it would cause to supply chains, transportation, the lack of electrical generation, no transportation, because every vehicle created since the early 1980s now has a computer-controlled system that runs the engine and runs the fuel injection. It runs the environmental systems on a car. Once those are gone, nothing starts. So no trucks, no cars, no trains, by the way, because trains are all diesel and they're all electronically controlled as well. Everything would shut down. So the idea of isolationism sounds really great, but is it a survivable strategy for the modern era? And I ask that knowing, by the way, that the United States has decided it is going to pull back from the post-World War II security guarantee of trade. It's just not going to do that anymore. We are not going to have a 600-ship Navy, which of course we haven't had for years at this point. In fact, we may not even have a 300-ship Navy. We have 11 aircraft carrier groups, and our current Navy size, perhaps a little smaller, is about as big as it's ever going to be. We have the ability to project American power with aircraft carriers. What we no longer have is the ability to patrol the sea lanes with destroyers and cruisers and maintain global security. We've decided we're not going to do that. In fact, I can remember reading in the Journal of the Proceedings of the Naval Institute the U.S. Navy's new idea back in about 2004, 2005, which is that we are going to now partner with other countries. So rather than there being a U.S. security guarantee, it's the United States and Australia and Japan, who, by the way, now have aircraft carriers again. And it would just be this multinational force that has a general agreement to patrol the seas, because the United States is no longer really interested in doing it. We are withdrawing into our shell. What that means is a multipolar world is emerging. The United States, Russia, China, although they each have their problems that we might discuss in a little bit. But we have a multipolar world. And the trouble with a multipolar world is historical experience is that a multipolar world is not necessarily a more peaceful world. And when the world's remaining superpower decides they're not going to play the international game anymore, what are the chances for peace in the world in general when you do have bad actors? Russia is a bad actor. China is a bad actor. North Korea is a bad actor. There are many other bad actors in the world who would be giddy with delight if they knew that they could attack neighboring nations, take their property, resources, whatever, and get away with it. And it's uncertain who is going to stop them. Now, we can make the argument philosophically, and it's an argument that's been made for many years. The U.S. is not the world's policeman. Okay, but then who is? Because it's clearly not the UN. The UN hasn't found the ability to agree on anything since the Korean War in 1950. And by the way, why the Russians didn't simply veto the Korean War resolution, I'll never know. I suspect it was because there was already a rift with China at that point, and they saw the Korean War as largely a Chinese project, and they weren't interested in helping it, which I guess turned out fine, because we did end up defending South Korea, and the Russians didn't take an act in opposing us, but they certainly opposed us everywhere else during the Cold War era. Now I don't know where we go. I don't know what a multipolar world looks like without the American security guarantee. And by the way, I'm perfectly happy as in the Afghanistan and Iraq examples indicate, I'm perfectly happy to say that the United States is probably not super well suited to the national will required to being the policeman of the world. And we tend, look, since World War II, we really haven't accomplished our aims anywhere. Yes, we managed to keep South Korea from falling to North Korea. And largely, that's the last big W that we had. So I hate to see this stuff from the Libertarian Party because it is so historically ignorant. And it kind of, it's a weird thing that we're seeing from the Libertarian Party, which is a critique of American policy from the left. That has not generally been the Libertarian Party's method of attacking. It's always been an attack more from the right than from the left. So this is a very complex subject, and there are, many things that we could talk about, but this idea that the Libertarian Party came up with was just poorly timed, and we'll leave it at that. So what else has been going on in the world? Well, over this last weekend, there were lots of protests, lots of Palestinian protests. In fact, they've been going on for a while now, and we can take a look at some pictures here from, I believe this is Germany. So these are pro-Palestinian protests in Germany. We can also see them in London, where probably over 100,000 people gathered in support of Hamas and Gaza in London. There was a similar one in Rome, and in Rome, a lot of people like this showed up. Now, this happens to be in England, the Queers for Palestine people. In Rome, the sign was, I have lost it now. I don't think I bookmarked it, but I can type it here. Allah loves equality. And I spelled equality wrong, of course. Actually, I think there is a... here we go. Here is the picture. I believe this was from Rome over this weekend. And these guys are running around talking about how much Allah loves the LGBT community. This brings up a lot of troubling things as well. Stuff that I'm not entirely sure how to address in our society. So let's take it as a matter of principle that individual rights are the most important thing that has come out of Western thought in the past 500 years. So the idea of individual rights, rights that the government really can't take away, that as our founding document says, that we are endowed by our Creator with these rights. We have to start there. Equality before the law and the inviolability of rights. Oh, by the way, from chat, the dysfunctions of the Libertarian Party is why I'm still a Republican. Well, I'm not even a Republican. I haven't been a Republican for years. I think I'm a registered independent. I mean, I largely don't have any association with either the Libertarian Party or the Republican Party. So I consider myself, in American terms, largely politically homeless. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying. Look, it's perfectly fine to protest against the government all that you want. Here's where it gets tricky. So I'm not sure how they do it in Britain, but I do know that in the United States, if you're going to become a citizen of the United States, there is a certain oath that you take. Part of which is that you will abjure all allegiance to any foreign power or potentate. So when you have and by the way, these same types of protests that I just showed you have been going on in New York and Chicago and Detroit, other places like that, pretty much anywhere there's a large Muslim community in the United States. And this Muslim community largely, not entirely, but largely consists of immigrants. So what do you do if you're a society that is committed to the concept of individual rights? A commitment, by the way, that I'm not entirely sure is shared all across the political spectrum in this country anymore, but let's take it as a starting point anyway for convenience. If you have a country that has that commitment, what do you do with a community that actively supports people who want to kill you or kill your allies? What, is there a penalty? Should there be a penalty if you're an immigrant for protesting on behalf of Hamas? Hamas, which, by the way, is a proscribed terrorist organization. Let's just put that out there. They are not good guys. They are terrorists. We recognize them as a terrorist organization, just as we do with Hezbollah or the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, if you're in support of a proscribed terrorist organization and you're an immigrant, what obligation do we have to keep you here? I mean, irrespective of whatever commitment we have to civil rights for our citizens, what obligation do we have towards immigrants who theoretically we're supposed to vet before they come here? Clearly, we're not doing a great job of that. And we have people in our society who generally hate our society. That why they wanted to come here, I'm not entirely sure, but they are here. They now hate our society. They hate our founding documents. They disagree strongly with the idea of individual liberty. And as one person up in Canada said when they were interviewed, once we're a majority here, we are going to enforce Sharia law upon you. I can't help but think of one of our Supreme Court justices, and I wish Michael was here because he could tell me which Supreme Court justice that might have been, who said the Constitution is not a suicide pact. At what point do we begin taking a look at these people and saying, look, you're here at our sufferance, and it seems like you would be happier in another country that doesn't have our system of laws. I mean, if you come here and you say, I'm going to be, I want to immigrate to America, and we let you in, and you get here and you say, okay, well, I hate this country. I hate the law they have because it's not, in this case, I suppose it would be Islamic law. And I want to overthrow that. And if we ever get a chance, we are going to tear down American democracy and replace it with a theocracy, with Sharia law, because that is what they honestly believe. What obligation do we have to keep them here? What would be the harm in deporting them back to whatever country they originally came from? Because they're not willing to be Americans. And the reason that I ask this is because something that we've talked about quite a lot on this program. America is not a blood and soil country and never has been. I know a lot of people on the far right, the KKKers and whatever, say, well, this has always been a white Christian nation. Well, it's true in the sense that most people who lived in America were white and that most of them were Christian. But as George Washington wrote in the Treaty of Paris in 1793, I believe it was, the United States cannot in any sense be said to be founded upon the Christian religion. We may be a culturally Christian nation. We are not a legally Christian nation and never have been. And we've always been a country that has cherished diversity of viewpoints. But if you have people who, but the thing about the United States is because it is not a blood and soil country, it is not a country where we can look back and say, well, this is where basically our entire society evolved. You know, if you go to the average person in Germany, their family has lived in Germany, or what was in the, before 1871 referred to as the Germanies, for all of recorded history. Well, at least until the Ostrogoths came in. So certainly several hundred years. And their culture has evolved entirely there, and they have a concept of nationhood that is tied to the concept of, well, as I said earlier, blood and soil. The United States is not that type of country. The United States is a specifically ideological country. The deal that we made with the rest of the world was if you believe in the same sort of things that we believe in terms of individual liberty and freedom, and however imperfectly we might have enforced it, the idea of equality for all people, then you are welcome here. And indeed, if we go back to the statue poem, send me your huddled masses yearning to be free. And the only thing that we asked for was, you're going to have to become an American. You're going to have to believe the things that we believe. Because that's the only thing that holds the country together. We are not tied to each other, and we don't consider citizenship to be tied to birth and blood ties and historical ties to the land in the way that it is considered in other countries. We are an ideological country. We are tied together by a set of ideas about human liberty. And those ideas are very, very fragile. And we know that they're fragile because if we go back through all of human history, the number of societies that have subscribed to those ideas, or the number of cultures that have subscribed to those ideas, can largely be counted on one hand. It is not a common idea in history. The most common form of political organization in history is absolute rule by a monarch or a dictator, a warlord, a chieftain. That has been the norm in human history. Indeed, one can say that our evolutionary environment predisposes us towards that sort of political organization. Find the guy who has the biggest stick, we'll all work for him and do what he says, because he may be able to provide security that will enable us to meet our other needs via our subservience to him. By the way, I am told by chat that the phrase suicide pact was first used in this context by Justice Jackson in his dissenting opinion in Terminiello v. Chicago, a 1949 case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, well, Justice Jackson. Justice Jackson, always good for a quote, apparently. So, going back to the current thing, what do we do about people who don't really want to subscribe to our ideals, but who want to live in this country and ultimately take it over and force us to subscribe to their ideals? Where does our commitment to individual liberty cross with our urge for self-preservation? I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that is. You know, the thing about democracy is that democracy is great at determining what it is the people want. However, it is silent about whether what the people want is a good thing or a bad thing. If you were to do a public poll on whether the police should be forced to read Miranda warnings, for example, to criminal suspects, to tell them, don't talk to me. I will try to put you in jail if you say anything that I can use to do so. How many people, if we had an election, would say, yeah, that's probably too far. If you don't know your rights, too bad for you. No more Miranda. How many people would vote against the right for the right against self-incrimination, your Fifth Amendment rights, not to testify against yourself? I mean, how many people currently, if you don't testify in a criminal trial, obviously in a civil trial it's a bit different because we're not looking at criminal guilt, but in a criminal trial, generally, certainly in the federal system, the judge actually has a specific charge to the jury that tells them this person didn't testify and you cannot make a conclusion one way or another because they didn't testify. They have the right not to testify. How many people, if you had an election, would vote for the proposition that if you don't testify in a criminal trial, the jury should consider you guilty, or the jury is free to consider you guilty because you didn't speak up in your own defense? And in general, an innocent person would want to speak up in their own defense. And if you didn't, the jury can make a negative connotation of that. Do you think that would pass a popular vote? I suspect it might. There are a lot of things that the Constitution prohibits the government from doing that if we were to have an election, a national referendum on that subject, we would probably, a majority of us would soften the Constitution's prescription. Look, we don't even have to go to the Fourth or Fifth Amendment. We can stop right at the First Amendment. How many people do you think would vote for the proposition in modern America in 2023 that the government should have the right to censor misinformation or hate speech? I think you could probably get a majority for that. It might be a close majority, but I think it would be a majority. So democracy is great, but democracy doesn't tell us anything about whether the policies the people want are good policies or bad policies. And by the way, you can look back into ancient Greece and you can see how democracy kind of falls on its face. If you were a general and you were successful and you won 9 battles out of 10 for Athens, but you lost that 10th battle, the public might be so upset that they would vote to have you at best exiled and at worst executed because you lost 1 out of 10 battles. Because the trouble with democracy is it gets caught up with the passions of the people. That, by the way, was why we were supposed to have a Senate. Let those slack-jawed morons in the House get all excited about whatever the current thing is, and the Senate will just calm them down and say, no, we're not going to do that, largely because the Senate wasn't supposed to be elected in the first place. So yeah, we had a Democratic arm of the government. It was explicitly Democratic, and we also had a non-Democratic arm of the government, or at least an indirectly Democratic arm of the government, because senators were elected by state legislatures. And the state legislators were, of course, elected by the citizens of each state. And the whole purpose of the Senate was to keep the wild-eyed radicals in the House, of whom it was proposed there would be many, keep them from going off the rails and doing something awful the way that the Greeks did, because the Greeks in Athens had pure democracy. Whoever happened to show up that day at the agora to cast their vote, if they were in the majority, they got to have whatever they wanted, which, as it turned out, was not a great long-term policy for Greece. So how do you prevent a population who is willing to import millions upon millions of people, many of them hostile to the country into which they are allowed to immigrate? What happens when they start voting? How do you protect your system? And what obligation do you have to keep them here and give them access to that system when what they really want to do is fundamentally change it? And not just change the shape and form of the government, but fundamentally change the principles by which we have decided we should govern ourselves and that we have largely lived by for the past 200 and some years. How do you handle that? I don't think that we have an obligation to keep immigrants who go out and protest in support of a proscribed terrorist organization. I don't think we have the obligation to keep them in the United States. I think it would be perfectly acceptable to say, look, this clearly isn't the country you want to live in. You have a different set of operating principles than the United States does. So maybe you shouldn't be here. But of course, that would mean having to find and deport millions of people, which we are told, of course, we could never do. And by the way, with a free and open southern border, how do we actually know who is coming here? It's not like the CBP is keeping track of every single person, or indeed can keep track of every single person. We really don't know who's coming through the southern border, and we largely give them a pass to wander around inside the United States for 3 to 5 years before they even have a court date come up, or 2 to 5 years before they even have a court date come up. What's going on in that 2 to 5 years? Who's keeping track of them? Who's following what they're doing? I'm pretty sure that that's nobody. So we have a problem, and I don't know how to democratically or in within the principles of a society committed to individual liberty, I don't know how you solve that problem. I think it is a good first principle that you do not have an absolute right to come into the United States, that we as a society have the right to set up a set of clear rules about what you have to do to be accepted in the United States. The other thing I think is the huge mistake is this idea that people who immigrate to the United States should have access to any of our welfare systems, any at all. I mentioned a few minutes ago the poem on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your huddled masses, yearning to be free. You know what? In 1876, during the United States Centennial, when France gifted us with that statue, and we had the competition to see what poem should go into the statue and a plaque for its dedication, that wasn't a bad idea. Because when you got to the United States, nobody in the government gave you any help. There was no welfare program. There was no income support. There was no aid for families with dependent children, AFDC. There were no food stamps. There was nothing. You got off the boat with the clothes on your back and whatever you had in your suitcase or steamer trunk, and those were the resources you needed to survive. Now, if you were lucky, you had a brother or a cousin or an uncle who had come over and had managed to establish themselves, and so you had some sort of familial support system. There were also charitable organizations, Catholic organizations, Protestant churches, many of them church-based, in fact, a lot of them church-based, who could support immigrants. If you were coming over from, say, Italy in 1901 and you were a stonemason, assuming that you were a good enough stonemason, you might get some support from joining a stonemasons guild, and after you had received work, being able to contribute into the guild's programs for retirements or whatever. There were social support systems here and there, but they were all voluntary or charitable. Well, they were all voluntary. Many of them were charitable, And some of them were self-help associations where immigrant groups got together and just created self-help organizations to help new immigrants come into the community, to help them find housing, help them find jobs, and whatnot, provide them with a support system. And we have this wonderful idea of all these millions of immigrants came to the United States, which is true. Prior to 1926, the United States had fairly open immigration. Pretty much anybody could come here at almost any time. What we don't hear are the story of the millions of people who came here, couldn't cut it, and ended up going back to England or Germany or France or Italy or Greece or wherever, or Norway. Well, actually, not so much Norway. People who came here from Norway or Scandinavia, Sweden, they tended to do pretty well here, which is probably a cultural thing, and probably they were well prepared by the time they got here to end up, as many of them did, cut off from everybody in some godforsaken town in North Dakota where they just started a farm and did fine for themselves. But the United States government didn't help anybody who came during that era of immigration. You know, all this talk about, oh, America's a melting pot and America has all these people and America has always been a nation of immigrants. Yeah, that's true. A nation of immigrants who came here on their own dime and who had to make it or go back home because they couldn't make it without any help from the United States government. That is not the situation that obtains today. Now when they come here, they get a lot of support, both from the United States government and from state, county, and city governments, who have various flavors of Medicaid for them, unemployment compensation, all of the other things that, by the way, they tend to be able to apply for. Not universally, but now, with the way that our southern border is open, we have opened up more and more of these services to immigrants. And because of that, I think we're an even greater draw. When you have a welfare state, and by the way, the American welfare state is actually, compared to the ones that they have in Europe, pretty freaking sketchy. You go to Europe, you go to a country like, well, where I lived, the Netherlands. You go to a country like the Netherlands, you want to talk about a welfare state. The Dutch government will take care of you from cradle to grave if they have to. You don't have a car and you're a drug addict and you need to get to a clinic, they'll pay for your taxi ride to the clinic. The government will just pick up that tab. Now, of course, they get taxed an average of 50% of their income right off the top to pay for these taxes or to pay for these services. So they're very highly taxed in order to pay for these services, but they have them. So if you think America has a powerful and generous welfare system, go live in Europe for a couple of years, especially in Northern Europe, and you'll be amazed by the level of social support that they give everyone, including these immigrants, including illegal immigrants that are going there. They're way ahead of us in that. But as Milton Friedman pointed out in the 1970s, look, you can have free and unrestricted immigration, or you can have a welfare state, but you can't have both. If you don't have a welfare state, you can allow anybody you want to come over here because reality is going to teach them harsh lessons, and it's going to force certain behaviors on them, or they will starve to death. If you have so the people who want to come over here, knowing that is the deal, tend to come over here prepared. They tend to come over here prepared to be Americans, prepared to sign on to the ideological baggage that America has as part of its history in terms of its principles for individual liberty. And they're willing to sign on, and they're willing to take the risk. What you get are the people who felt stifled in their home countries. For example, let's take Britain, right? 19th century Britain. Why would I, in 1830, want to come to the United States rather than stay in Britain? Well, if you were born to a lower or lower class family, or even a middle class family, really, you had no real means of social advancement in England because of the class structure. And by the way, this is largely true in France as well, although France, for part of that time, at least up to 1820, was putatively a republic. If you want to consider revolutionary France a republic, sure, it was of sorts. But even though that was true, there was still a hereditary aristocracy who, after Napoleon got beat, jumped right back into, in 1820, jumped right back into power. Although Napoleon's nephew threw them out of power. French history of the 1900s is complex. But England, Germany, France, you had hereditary aristocracies. You were forced into a little bubble that you really couldn't climb out of in your home country. The United States did not have that sort of class system. Anyone could become wealthy. Anyone could ultimately have political power in the United States in a way that was simply not possible in Germany or France or Holland or England and Scotland. The class system was too rigidly entrenched. And so the people who came over here were the troublemakers, the people who wanted to be free of those shackles and who wanted to see what they could make of themselves. That sort of system, no social welfare, just come over here and good luck to you. If you find some friends to help you, that's great. If not, I guess you'll have to go back home. That sort of system brings in a different type of immigrant than a welfare state. Once you begin to say, hey, we're going to start covering your medical insurance or medical services through Medicaid, and we're going to give you food stamps so that you can go to the store and buy stuff to eat, and we'll probably have, in some cities, rent control, so we can get you a rent-controlled apartment so that you don't have to pay a lot in rent, certainly below market rates. There's all of these incentives to bring in people, but the people that it brings in, the incentivization that is created by a welfare state tends to bring in a different kind of person. Because now they don't have to be risk takers. Now they can come in and essentially live not well in the United States, but live off of that system. You're asking for a different kind of immigrant. You're incentivizing a different kind of immigrant, and incentives matter. And so when you bring in a bunch of people, and by the way, and this is the other problem with the whole libertarian idea, which I think I've mentioned before. The whole idea behind open immigration, and look, it doesn't matter whether it's the libertarians, doesn't matter whether it's the Chamber of Commerce community who just want a whole bunch of immigrants because they want to pay cheaper wages. It doesn't really matter where you come from on the political spectrum. The fundamental conceit of open immigration, and by the way, this is true of the people on the left as well, who I left out, who think that, we need to have all of these people in here because after all, as the left is famous for saying, who will pick our lettuce? Which we won't even get into the whole idea of how that just implies that you believe there should be a permanent lettuce-picking underclass for all of your talk of supposed equality. But let's elide past that. The fundamental idea behind all of those, wherever you come from on the ideological spectrum, is that these people who are going to come into your country are no more than fungible economic units. And whatever their thoughts might be about politics and political power and the economic system of who cares? They're all just economic units. They are workers that we can plug into job positions to fill at a certain wage so that our lettuce is cheap and our tomatoes get to the store quickly and are fresh. Okay, but the trouble is, these aren't just fungible units. They're human beings. They have their own ideas about how polities should be organized, their own ideas about how wealth should be structured or shared or distributed across society. And once they get access to the political system, they have the ability to put these ideas into action. In other words, we can bring a whole bunch of people over here that really hate the system that we have built over the last 200 years, and they could return us to a system much like the one in the country that they immigrated from, which has not, over the past 200 years, led to the greatest flowering of human wealth and freedom that the world has seen in the entire 250,000-year history of modern humans being on this planet. And in a society where democracy is the chief value, there's literally no reason why you could deny them this, simply as a matter of principle. The whole point of the Constitution, the point specifically of the Bill of Rights, is to say, look, there are some things that are just not up for a vote. There are some things that no matter how many people want it, they cannot have. And we've encoded those in the Bill of Rights. Even at the beginning of our country's founding, we realized that democracy is great, and it's a great way of figuring out what people want, but people can't be allowed to have some things. And the one thing, really, it's people can't be allowed to have one thing. And the one thing that they can't control are your thoughts, your opinions, your property, your life, or prior to the income tax, your income. That was not up for debate. Everything else was, but those principles were not up for debate. Increasingly, they are up for debate now, not just among people on the left who, hate their hate speech and they hate their disinformation or misinformation, and they're willing to give up the First Amendment to force you from disagreeing with them or prevent you from disagreeing with them, to people who come here from outside the United States, from other cultures, who do not have a history of political pluralism and human rights, and who would, if they could, impose those views of politics and economics and human rights on our society. I think it's a crisis, and I think it's something that we need to address. How we address it and how we do so in a manner that's consonant with our historical principles, I honestly don't know. Because it seems to me that after a certain point, the crisis becomes so severe that there's no easy way to fix it, no principled and peaceful way to fix it. And I would hope that we're not there yet, but I am increasingly concerned that we are. And either way, by the way, we lose the country we grew up in. That's the hell of it right there. Because if we allow these people to take over and just remove our rights, okay, you don't have the right to free speech, or you have the right to free speech as long as it's the approved speech, which, by the way, is just the same as saying you don't have freedom of speech. We're going to take away the Second Amendment. You can't own guns because only the government should have guns. The government, the people who hire the racist police who shoot black people. They're the only ones who should be armed. Maybe you shouldn't be freed from the obligation to testify against yourself at trial. That will not be the United States of America. If we get rid of the First and Second and Fourth and Fifth Amendments, we are no longer a free people. But here's the thing. If you have a very large percent of the people, a large plurality of the people in your country who are willing to impose those views on the rest of us, and you have to do something illiberal to prevent them from doing so, you've basically launched a civil war. And what you're going to end up with at the end of that is an illiberal government who is just going to be illiberal in a way that benefits you rather than benefits your ideological enemies. And that won't be the United States either. So it's a very complex issue, and I don't have answers for it. I can analyze the problem, but trying to figure out what would be a principled response, I'm not sure. And by the way, nobody is sure. One of the reasons why we've been talking for years about there's going to either be a great national divorce where the United States is going to split up, or there's going to be a civil war, worst case scenario, is because we have these opposing political ideas that don't even speak the same political languages and certainly don't want to be governed by the other side. I don't know how you keep a peaceful, stable civil society together when there are fundamental differences between basic terms like what rights are. What does rights mean? If you're a traditional American thinker, you generally fall under the idea of natural rights. We have natural rights simply because we are humans. And as humans, we each have inherent dignity, and there are some things that no one else can do to us ethically. You can't steal from me. You can't kill me. You can't, well, I guess fraud, cheating would be stealing. So you can't kill from me. You can't steal from me. You can do anything else you want, but you can't do those two things. Oh, and you can't enslave me. Although that was largely honored in the breach prior to 1865. Nevertheless, if you have those as ideas, then how do you stop the people who disagree with you? That's the problem. And look, it was why there was a communist sort of crisis, or the Red Scare of the 1950s. We knew what the communists wanted. And we knew that they were willing to use force to do it. So how do you fight them? What you end up with is an FBI that does some pretty sketchy things going after communists. You end up with the blacklist in Hollywood. You end up with all of those other things that we all now decry today. But, and look, maybe in the long view, we shouldn't have done it at that time. I don't know. I didn't live back then. So all of my knowledge comes from books, and many of those books are written by people who have a very specific point of view about the Red Scare. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. But in any event, we have a crisis that we are facing whenever we see millions of people who are just perfectly happy to support Hamas because they have fallen into, which is the other thing. Oh my God, how much time have we been on here? Okay, 1 hour and 7 minutes, and I'm still talking. We have fallen into, many of us have fallen into the modern progressive oppressor-oppressed victimology ideology, where, these people must be oppressed. These people, because they're in opposition to them, must therefore be their oppressors. And everyone has an oppressor, and everyone is oppressed to a very slight degree, except, of course, for, in the formation, generally white males who are the top tier oppressors. And then you have, descending levels of oppression of which you are capable all the way down, which basically just divides everybody into warring tribes. I mean, the whole point of the United States, the whole point of its ideology, the ideology of all men being created equal, was that we got away from this whole idea of oppressed and oppressors. Now, I know that the idea didn't exist back in 1776, but the idea of oppressed and oppressors is in direct contravention to the idea that it is individual rights and individual liberties that matter, and that collective rights don't exist. There are no collective rights. There are no collective responsibilities. There is no such thing as collective guilt. America is a nation founded on the idea of individual liberty and individual responsibility. And the entire notion of class or race or ethnically based tensions being the foundation for our system of government and our foundation for determining who gets jobs, who should be promoted, who should get an education, who gets accepted at college, who doesn't. That's antithetical to the traditional American idea. It is a collectivist ideology. And collectivist ideology is cancer. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I am on the side of individual equality and individual freedom. And I am simply not going to kowtow to those silly ideas. But how to overcome them, how to fight them, that I am not quite as sure of. All right, so let's take a break. Let's take a look at another little thing that I just wanted to talk about for a few minutes because I think we'll probably start winding down now. You may not remember, a couple of weeks ago, Democrat Jamal Bowman pulled a fire alarm at the Capitol. He's been charged with a misdemeanor for that. He's pled guilty to that misdemeanor. He'll probably get a fine and a little slap on the hand, and he'll walk away from it. However, the story he told was an interesting story, which is, hey, I went out and I tried to get out of the building. And by the way, I don't want to show this yet. I'll have to bring it back here and let's stop it. He said he was just trying to get out of the Cannon office building and get into the House chamber because there was a vote and he was in a hurry. And then he didn't see any signs and he didn't know. And he thought that if he pulled the fire alarm, by the way, this guy was a high school principal. Okay, he knows what a fire alarm does. He knows what a fire alarm looks like. And he knows what happens when a sophomore pulls one. Okay, let's not. I don't believe his story that he was confused about the nature and purpose of a fire alarm. And of course, now we know that he's just a liar because we have the video of him pulling the fire alarm. So the idea was he went up, he tried to get out of the door, he couldn't get out of the door, he was all confused. So he then turned around and he thought pulling the fire alarm would open the door and that would get him out. Sure, that's what happened. Because we now have the video from the Cannon office building that shows him going up there, removing the signs, throwing one on the ground, pulling the fire alarm, and walking away. That's not a fella who is trying to get out of the building. He's just pulling the signs down, knocking them down, pulling the fire alarm, and walking away. This was intentional. He meant to do that, and by golly, he did it, and now he's walking away with basically a slap on the hand, a misdemeanor conviction. There was one more thing I wanted to talk about, and it was some talk this week about how bad weather is getting and how bad climate change is and what have you. And when you look at the data, it actually, all of the apocalyptic things that we're hearing about climate change don't actually appear to be true. So here is a shot of climate-related disaster deaths since the 1920s compared with the rise in CO2 from 300 ppm to a little over 400 ppm, about 420 to 430 ppm parts per million of the atmosphere. And we can see climate-related disaster deaths dropping. So that's great. Atlantic hurricanes. Now, this is a short-term thing, so it doesn't give us much, but apparently there have been some increases in hurricanes since the 1980s, especially for large Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. However, not because the climate is getting warmer, but because of a recovery from a deep minimum in the 1960s through the 1980s. So apparently we had a 20-year space where there were very, very few Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. And since then, we have returned to the historical norm. And if you want to look at the trend lines for different types of hurricanes, Cat 4 and 5 here, which is slightly trending upward, but not so much as you would notice. It's a very flat trend line. That's the dotted line we're seeing across here. Global major hurricanes trending actually slightly down, although it's very difficult to tell from the trend line here, the dotted line in the middle of that graph, but it does trend down since 1990 for just global hurricanes overall. So in general, the trend has been for fewer global hurricanes since 1990. Hurricanes that hit land, also a downward trend looking at the dotted line. Major landfall hurricanes, so it's Cat 4 and 5 hurricanes, also have a dotted line down. Climate models. Now, all of these little lines are the lines of climate models and what they predicted the atmosphere would look like. And these are climate models starting in the 1970s and proceeding to today. So these are the predicted temperatures of all the climate models. And the big black line in the middle there is the mean of all of the model predictions. And the gray line that we see, the thick gray line, the one down at the very bottom, those are actual observed temperatures via balloon and satellite observations. So as you can see, there is quite a big delta between those two. If you want to look financially, this is what global weather losses based on insurance payout have been as a percent of GDP from 1990 to 2022. As you can see, the red trend line there is down. And one of the things that people talk about for, climate damage is, well, look at the millions of dollars in insurance payments that go out in places like, Miami when there's a hurricane. Okay, well, there may be a reason for that, because as Michael Schellenberger points out, this is Miami Beach in 1925 on the left. On the right is Miami Beach in 2017. There may be a reason for why insurance losses are so much higher today than they might have been 100 years ago as a percentage of GDP. Death rates from storms constantly dropping. Death rates from drought has dropped to almost nothing. Death rate from floods looks bad for the world, but the G7 countries tend to be looking good. Indeed, the G7 countries look good when you look at world death rate from storms. So I just wanted to point that out. We are kind of in a era of climate alarmism, and I don't think we need to have quite as much climate alarmism as we have been seeing, certainly not when you begin to look at the numbers. I think Bjorn Lomborg, I guess he's Swedish environmentalist, who really 20 years ago came out and said, look, the policy prescriptions from the environmental lobby for fighting global warming would be more hurtful than just trying to ameliorate the bad effects of global warming or climate change. Is the climate changing? Yeah, it is. Almost incontestably. Are we causing it? I'm less sanguine about that. I'm certain that we have some effect on climate change. I am also certain that there are many other factors, including solar and other factors that have an effect on climate change. I don't believe that we should be as sure about anthropogenic climate change as some people make out. And I think the policy prescriptions for fighting climate change are probably far more expensive and far worse than just the climate change. Let me give you an example. Toyota this last week, or maybe it was the week before last, the head of Toyota came out and said, look, we think that electric vehicles are crap. We shouldn't have electric vehicles. The environmental damage, forget about the atmosphere. There's other forms of environmental damage. And creating these batteries increases these other forms of environmental damage, especially using heavy metals where that environmental damage may not be ameliorated for many, many, many years. We could make, if you want progress, the Toyota's idea is, look, the idea for progress is not to go gas, electric, because the amount of heavy metals that you need, the polymers that you need to create the batteries, that puts a lot of environmental stress on the planet in a chemical sense, and in a sense of mining operations and pollution. Sure, it's not air pollution, it's not CO2, but let's not forget that the actual production of all of these things does indeed have its own CO2 price tag, the ability to produce them, transport them. And what Toyota said was, look, we could produce 15 hybrid vehicles for the cost that it takes in terms of battery technology of producing a single EV. So for each EV that we put on the road, we could have produced 15 hybrid vehicles, which would reduce our gas consumption by 80 to 90% without the same level of environmental damage per vehicle for each car. And you know what? I think Toyota's right. These electric mandates, all of which are based on climate alarmism, are bad policy. Even if we were to assume, arguendo, that everything the climate alarmist ideology tells us is true, and by the way, it may in fact be true. I'm not saying it is not true. Oh, by the way, Bjorn Lomborg is Danish. Well, Danish, Norse, who cares? I've been playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and the British are calling everybody a Dane. So, Scandinavian, they all just sort of meld in together somehow. But as I was saying, these policies are probably bad policies. It's an all or nothing policy prompted by the intention of, and the way they're getting support is by the intention of causing panic. And then they say, well, this is the solution. We got to go with all electric vehicles. Do we really? Because electric vehicles are far more expensive. The technology, as wonderfully as it's grown for the past, 20 years, is still not there. You still have the range problem, the range and recharge time problem. If that is not fixed, electric cars are just a non-starter. Because people have to live their lives. People have to make trips. They have to go places and saying, okay, 200 miles and then 8 hours of charging. That's just not going to work in people's lives. I mean, that might not even work if you have to live and commute in Los Angeles. I mean, if you live in Rancho Cucamonga and you have to drive down the 10 to wherever you work in Los Angeles every day with that traffic, that 200-mile range, that assumes a free and open road where you can just drive at 55 miles an hour and you can get 200 miles. What that does not say is that if you are stuck in stop-and-go traffic for an hour and a half, like here in San Diego, driving from, say, Fallbrook, California, which is in north part of San Diego County, which I used to do because I used to live there, drive from Fallbrook down into downtown San Diego or La Jolla. That's an hour and a half trip, one way. Sure, it's only 25 miles as the crow flies, and yet it still takes you an hour and a half to get there. And by the way, that's an hour and a half back. Can you even commute in a car, an electric car with a 200-mile range? And by the way, in the summer, it's like 120 degrees. What are you going to do? Not turn on the air conditioning? Well, that's going to cut your range. Not turn on the stereo and listen to the radio? If you do, that's going to cut your range. It's a problem. It's a problem that hybrids solve completely. Hybrids solve both the range problem and, by the way, the exploding battery problem. When you've got 2,000 pounds of NiCad battery cells in the floor of your vehicle, if one of them catches fire, that's a bad thing. And as we know, electric cars catch on fire. There was one period a couple of months ago where like once or twice a week there was a Tesla blowing up. And how about the Samsung phones, which were just blowing up left and right? It was the Samsung Galaxy a couple of years ago. Look, lithium-ion batteries aren't like perfectly safe. They're certainly not as safe and stable as the old lead acid batteries were. So if I could solve all that and I could build 15 hybrid vehicles for one electric vehicle, why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't that be the policy? Because even if we assume that we're using the same amount of electrics that we would with one single car, that still allows us to build 15 hybrids for the environmental damage that building one electric car would do. In other words, each vehicle is reducing the environmental damage by 15 times. Why wouldn't we do that? Well, that's not how government policy works. So anyway, that was the stuff that I had. Oh, by the way, I like the EV concept, but the necessary baseload generation capacity just isn't there. We'll have to greatly expand to make it possible. Well, we didn't even talk about the whole idea of electric generation capacity. We simply don't have the generation capacity to charge everybody's electric cars. We just can't do it. There is not enough electrical generation power in the country. I believe I saw something a couple of weeks ago, an estimate, that it would require like a 25 or 30% increase in electrical power generation across the board everywhere in the country if we were to go to electric cars. And it may actually be higher than that. It may have been 35 to 45%. Either way, that 25% isn't going to happen. It's so difficult to build any sort of power plant in the United States, in the modern United States, because of environmental regulations. Don't tell me that we are now going to build another 45%. Essentially, we're going to build, we're going to increase the number of power generation stations we have by half by the way, before 2035? No, that's just not going to happen. Anyway, as I said, those were the things that I wanted to talk about this week. I'd have loved to have had Michael here to talk about them, but hopefully he'll be here next week and we can talk then. And if not, maybe it'll just be me all by myself again. In any event, have a great week. We'll look forward to talking to you next week. So long.